Do you guys remember how on Zoom to move the other participants to the side? Yeah, you know how you have gallery view and speaker view?
It's on the right, I think, on the upper right. You have
Yeah,
like squares in different shapes, in different structures.
maybe
Do you have that?
I do. Yeah, I'm looking at it. I keep doing speaker view, but it puts all you guys, puts you up at the top. I want you on the side.
You can full screen, but it puts you on the side.
Maybe you can't do that with this mode, but maybe if you do a very little window, maybe you will have that on your computer screen if you do a really little window,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure.
Well, it's not the end of the world. It's just easier. I think it's easier for if it would stack. I know it. You could stack the people on the side.
I don't know if that's an option. I know when you share screen, you can move the people.
Yeah. Well, I just did what I think one of you suggested is full screen. So I think that's better. Oh, then I can do this. There we go. Okay. All right. I hear people coming. Perfect time. Okay. So I am now recording. All right, so this is where we left off last time with the this, I'll call it a metaphor for now. I think it's a little more than a metaphor, but the vision metaphor. But I just wanted to reinforce it because I'll come back to it in this discussion. I'll talk a little bit more this time. I'll do a little bit more of a lecture this time. We'll have plenty of time for discussion. And then ideally we'll talk about a little bit about, go back to our cloud with the what shall not be named strategy. But for now, I want to use Hofmeyr to help us do something difficult. The crux of the course is radical creativity, not just any creativity. So we want to make a distinction as we're trying to describe the process that shall not be named. We want to narrow in on some of the harder questions, and I'm a huge fan of Hofmeyr, and I think he characterizes the problem pretty well, but I do think he runs into some trouble. And I think this code biology section is pretty illustrative of what's happening. So I'll just read this for the sake of the people online and the recording. The widespread tendency to see DNA as the main actor in the unfolding life process is probably due to the fact that the genetic code as carried in the DNA molecules is a digital code. And in fact, Western culture is profuse with digitalism, by which I mean an exaggerated trust in the performative power of digital codes. Let me take a moment here to explain what I mean. The alternative to a digital code is analog code. And this kind of code is based on the principle of analogy. In an old watch, for instance, the pointers circle the watch dial in a kind of analogy of the perceived rotation of the sun around the Earth. Note, however, that the coding principle in digital codes is necessarily arbitrary relative to the content. I really like what he's saying here. I think he's pointing out something that I think we've all noticed, we all tend to do. We tend to take whatever, well, every era does this in humanity, you know, in the time of the, you know, previous machines, people would, you know, like in the time of Copernicus or Galileo, they would think of the universe as a clockwork universe, that they would explain the universe based on the most advanced technology of the time. And we're no different. You know, we conceive of the world as we try and make sense of that which we don't understand via you know, this metaphor. And I think Hofmeyr is right to point out that it's overextended, this idea of digitalism. It's not necessarily, he's pointing out that this isn't necessarily going to serve our purposes of understanding semiosis. The first is that messages expressed in digital codes do not have to observe the limitations of freedom imposed by natural laws. Possible as well as impossible messages may be expressed in digital codes. Thus, in a novel, Meryl Streep might well have lunch with Socrates. So this is where I feel he's getting into a little bit of trouble. I'll just read the next one. It is this property of digital codes that explains the surprising evolutionary creativity of living systems, the incredible combinatorial capacity, and the consequent incessant testing of the eventual limits for possible combinations. Okay, coming back here, the first thing I want to challenge is that is to conceive of, for example, this idea that our ability to imagine impossible things is necessarily digital. I think that, well, we can come back to this, but I think this is where he begins to get a little bit into trouble, because I'm quite certain that I imagine impossible things all the time without digital code. In fact, like the author who writes any novel is I would argue, you know, conceiving of their ideas via what Hofmeyr would conceive of as analog codes. Of course, Hofmeyr is he's more sophisticated than I'm sort of characterizing right now. And he understands that there's both digital and analog at the same time. But I think that when we use these binarisms of analog and digital, we, without very carefully pointing out how there's the digital and the analog and the analog and the digital, I think we can run into trouble. I think Hofmeyr in a lot of places is careful that way, but in other places like here, I don't think he's quite as careful. So for example, I think that, as we've alluded to last time, there's this idea that once we have these, so one of the aspects of digital that he points out is this idea of discrete, that you have these discrete elements, and that creativity, or the ability to be adaptive, like an adaptive living system, for example, or evolution for that matter, is merely a matter of rearranging these already discrete elements. I think this is really problematic. I mean, it begs the question of where, as I discussed in previous lectures, where did these relata come from before? We can't just, what I suggest is that there's already even in Hofmeier's terminology, there's already complications of so-called analog and digital attributes that are responsible for each of these elements and their relations as they co-emerge. And that creativity, to conceive of creativity as merely recombining each of these elements, whether they're words in a novel or you know, codons in the DNA sequence, that it begs the question that we have to wonder how it is that, in fact, what I'll argue is that a great deal of many analog processes were involved in the emergence of each of these individual things and their relations, before we can even get to, we can conceive of creativity as merely rearranging these elements. So again, but is arbitrary organization creative in the adaptive radical sense? And yeah, that's essentially what I was just articulating. Again, you know, this course is one of its main assertions. What I hope to convince you guys of by the end of the semester is that there's a very real difference between what it is in contemporary culture, even in the most technical manifestations, you know, of our technologies like AI, for example, or even our theories of evolution, for example, are predicated on merely recombining already assumed relata. So what I want to do is say that, you know, there's another fundamental and missing type of creativity. So I'll show this quick video here. Apologize for the ad that's going to pop up right now, but this is just like 5 minutes. And what I want to do for the next number of slides is I just want to dig into what is digital, where are we right now? Let's really understand this assumption and what people mean by discrete states and digital, and how it is a lot of our technology works these days.
Vinatina virtual zit betrit, et leidet täiuslik värv toovistiin.
Uus viis lastega hommikusöögi lõbutseda. Nestletrix, lõbu algab siit.
Back at the start of the 20th century, mathematicians were fascinated by the question, just how much maths can we do? Not by using our gut feelings or intuitions, but just by following rules very, very carefully, by following an algorithm. In order to make that notion precise, we would have to set out just what do we mean by a program or algorithm. And this is where Alan Turing came in with his notion of a Turing machine. Turing was working on a problem in formal logic. And as part of his proof, he had to come up with a notion of any possible algorithm or any possible machine. He had to come up with a very general way of capturing how algorithms or programs or machines would work. This is where his notion of a Turing machine comes in. The way Turing described these machines goes like this. You have a way of writing down information in a coded form. His way was to think of a tape, which is as long as it needs to be. It's divided up into squares. And on each of these squares, there's either a 1 or a 0, or we can have some spaces. Now, what our machine does is it looks at the tape one square at a time. So you could imagine it as a little box running above the tape, maybe on little wheels, looking one square at a time. And that information codes up a question or a problem that we want solved. What the Turing machine does is really simple. At any moment in time, it's in a particular state and it's looking at one square on the tape. And it has a logbook, a program book, and that tells it, if, for instance, you're in state number 23 and you're looking at a 0, then rub out the 0, change it to a 1, move one square to the right, and move into state number 359. for instance. Or if you're in state number 359 and you're looking at a 1, leave that 1 as it is, move 1 square to the left, and move into state number 20. Really simple instructions. What the machine does is it starts off with a certain pattern of 1s and 0s. It follows these rules 1 square at a time, transforming that string of 1 and 0s into a different string of 1s and 0s. And eventually, hopefully, the machine moves into a halting state. It's finished, it's done. And what's left on the tape is the answer to our problem, coded up as 1s and 0s. That is such a simple process, but it turns out it's the essence of computation. Whatever any computer can do, it could in theory be done by that system looking at 1s and 0s on a tape. So that's why we say that Turing, in coming up with this idea of Turing machines, in effect came up with a blueprint for modern digital computers. Those computers manipulate strings of 1s and 0s to solve problems. This really simple idea that we find in Turing machines is actually so powerful that all modern computers basically do what Turing machines do. And we use this idea to evaluate the strength of modern computer programs. When a computer program can do what a Turing machine can do, we call it Turing complete. And that is the top of the hierarchy of program strength. So the strongest program that we can get does exactly what a Turing machine can do. We've never come up with a way of computing things that could do more than a Turing machine. So recently, there's been a challenge to the idea that anything a computer can do, a Turing machine can do. And the challenge comes from quantum computers, which almost seem like they can do things magically. My take on this is that a quantum computer can't do more than a Turing machine, but it can do things more efficiently. For instance, if you asked a classical computer to find you a phone number in the phone directory, you have to look through every single entry. It takes a long time. But a quantum computer can do that more efficiently. Don't ask me how.
Okay. Are there any questions about that before I go on? Just a couple thoughts. So one thing that's interesting is this tape that he was describing. And that it's actually infinite in both directions, countably infinite, which is in contradistinction to what it is we were talking about before about transfinite, infinity. So we can come back to that, but this is just an important. There is actually, and the reason why you need this so-called infinity is, and why it is he's emphasizing that. The Turing model is an abstraction. It can be built in arbitrarily many ways. And the reason why it's the most powerful is because it does actually imagine an arbitrarily long, tape, which can be conceived of as countably infinite. What's one of the things that I want to highlight, and that'll be pretty relevant to the next number of slides, is the idea that the program looks. I don't think it's a stretch to that you guys understand that basically there's a programmer that makes a program anticipating what needs to be looked at, and that the halting problem is essentially managed by programmers. So if any of you have ever written code before, one of the things that you're always worried about is an infinite loop. And that's the halting problem, is that where you get caught in a series of recursions that don't have what's called a base case, and that the computer will forever call its. So, for example, one classic infinite loop is that in a recursion that the function will call itself again and again and again and again, and there's no indication for it to stop doing that. So that happens actually quite a bit, and you need programmers to have it not do that. We'll come back to algorithms because that'll be a really critical relationship with randomness. And then a third thing. Okay. One thing I want to point out, just to kind of dig in, like we're really digging in the dirt here. We're really digging into the technology and to interrogate Hofmeier's code duality, not necessarily to disagree with Hofmeier, but really to, at least delimit sort of the bounds of, understand the bounds of his metaphor. Because what's interesting is like, this is a classic logic gate. This is one of the ways in which that little program that he showed that comes and looks and changes ones and zeros. This is one of the most common ways. The NAND gate, because of its efficiency and it's the logical gate that requires the least amount of component parts. It's used the most in all of your devices, and it's one of the ways that if it receives a 0 and a 0, it'll output a 1, a 0 1 1, a 1 1, a 0. What's really interesting here with respect to this analog digital is that this is an analog circuit. It's actually, these transistors are actually analog. So point being is that digital requires analog. This is, a lot of people don't realize this, especially when we start talking about like, oh, digital, the universe could be digital. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe, but understand that this conception that Turing and others, von Neumann and Boolean logic, Babbage machine, Ada Lovelace. I mean, the history of computation is fascinating. But it's all predicated on analog components able to achieve what I would just suggest is probably the apex of the Industrial Revolution, is this pretty much perfect accuracy. It's the idea of perfect state. It's something that humanity, it's almost like utopia. It's like this we strive to reduce ambiguity in our lives as a species, for a whole host of reasons that are more psychological in nature. But this is like a triumph of our ability to organize electricity in a very analog, used in a very analog fashion, to realize such accuracy and persistence of discrete state. And the key, of course, is that they are discrete. And Hofmeier's right to highlight that this is a distinction, a very important distinction with analogs and the more transfinite continuum that I'm trying to highlight. Okay, I'll try and go through these cybernetics things somewhat quickly. Stop me if you want, or we can come back to them. Yeah, so anyway, first order cybernetics. So you leveraging the logic of computers, the discipline of cybernetics, which actually Lotman was really interested in, which I'll come back to in a sec. But there's first order and second order cybernetics. First order cybernetics is basically like your thermostat. You have an arbitrary set point, so let's say 20 degrees, and then there's and then it measures the actual state of the room, which maybe is like, let's say 22 degrees. Based on that measurement of that difference, it'll steer the system back towards the arbitrary set point, which is set, programmed either into the system and or set by a user. And what's interesting about this idea of steering, so it's literally steering, is that's the etymology of cybernetics, back to the Greek. I think it goes back to steersman, like on a river. So like imagine like you could have a boat. You know, this is where the ship, the person steering the ship wants to go, but then there's all these contingencies in the actual world that pushes them off course, and then their job is to maintain course. So when they go off course, they can assess that and then steer back. The move with second order cybernetics, which is itself a really, really interesting lineage. Von Forster and Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, and even probably Lotman for that matter. They really wanted to try and understand how it is they could essentially insert this, what was obviously an external stipulation of the setting of the set point. They wanted to imagine how it is that the system could set its own set point. You could imagine how this gets into teleology, like, how it is the system itself can set its own goals, because they really wanted to understand how living systems work. And this was their path, like this was one of the ways that they conceived of trying to do this. And so that the set point is still arbitrary, but the idea that it could be set intrinsically. So Ashby, which Lotman was really interested, there's a great paper if you guys are interested in this lineage. Sylvie, our professor here, she wrote a great paper about Lotman's interest in the Soviet era, looking at cybernetics, and how Lotman was actually quite interested in cybernetics, and in particular Ashby. So here we have Ashby's homeostat. It's actually analog. It's all analog. It's a system that when it gets, these are these are military grade, or I think they're used in navigation for flying, themselves to regulate, I think, navigation of airplanes. So he took 4 of them and connected them to each other so that they would have a dynamical, the intended operating state would be this dynamical balance between each of the systems. But when they became arbitrarily perturbed, they would get knocked out of the intended operational state, at which point the system would go through a series of selectors to built-in resistors that would change the internal state, literally reconfigure itself so that it could reacquire the intended operation. So it was kind of an interesting attempt to do that second order cybernetics, have this intrinsic capacity to reorient itself in order to maintain homeostasis. But then the question is, like, where is the arbitrarity? Arbitrarity in this case, very interested in, like, for example, ostensibly our ability to arbitrarily set our own goals, make our own choices, just like the folks of second order cybernetics were trying to understand how a machine might be able to do that in the way that animals do, or we do certainly. But in this particular case, these array of randomly chosen resistors are chosen a priori by the designer to stabilize internal dynamics on external perturbation. And of course, there was also the built-in, set point, the built-in, I won't say set point, but the built-in intended dynamic, which was rather solipsistic, meaning it was just one particular dynamic. It wasn't much more interesting than that. Jumping to today, machine learning. Interestingly, it's actually quite a similar. Oh, of course, this is digital. It's not analog like the Ashby's homeostat, but it's obviously a very powerful system. So, for example, in oversimplifying hugely, you have you have a series of, say, handwritten numbers, and then you input these pixels into these input nodes. All these interconnections are randomly, very importantly, have to be randomly set, arbitrarily, if you will, randomly set, so that all their weights and balances are totally random. Then you put in, with all the training data, all these different handwritten numbers, you're putting in all the pixels, say there's 784 pixels, you plug them in there. The system already knows it needs to be a 7. This is what's called supervised learning, because the data is tagged. And what happens is that clearly when this happens for the first time, it's going to do horribly because these are all random. But what'll happen is that you have this, again, this difference. There's a common theme here. We could talk about structuralism and modern computation. It's a fascinating conversation. There's a difference here. There's a difference between what actually happens and what's intended. This is called the cost function. But this delta, this difference, that can then be back propagated to all the weights and balances, and up, it sort of knows, so to speak, which direction to tweak all these weights and balances in order to inexorably, monotonically move towards a greater accuracy of coming up with a 7. What's interesting about these systems, notable for our purposes, is that the arbitrarity, like where's the arbitrarity here? Well, there's certainly arbitrarity in randomizing all the weights and balances that give it the capacity to be eventually in about these, when it receives input, to be about the intended symbol, so to speak. But it also is fundamentally based on external data sets, that it's essentially, these are automated optimization systems that are, in essence, what they do is they create a program. So for example, there's a program here. There's a very relatively simple program that takes a measurement, and if it's out of whack, then it moves towards its intended state. Similarly, what these systems do is that they actually generate a very complex function, but it's a fixed function nonetheless. So in essence, what these systems are doing is generating a thermostat that it's generating its own bespoke super high polynomial function in order to index from its input to the trained output. So in that sense, it's arbitrary in a sense. It's certainly arbitrary in the sense that whatever this super high dimensional function that it comes up with can't be anticipated from the outset. But it's not so arbitrary in the sense that it's essentially just extracting structure that already exists out in the world. I would argue, I'll continue to argue that it's more of this if it is creative, it's creative in this recombinatorial sense. It's not creative in the radical sense that I want to try and impart on you guys this semester. Last one here. This is an interesting one. Has any of you heard of active inference, free energy principle? Okay. So this is, I shouldn't spend too much time on this one. it's just another model that's trying to essentially do second order cybernetics. It's very popular right now. I'm sure you'll come across it at some point. You'll even see it in popular, if you follow any popular articles, it'll pop up every now and again. And it's essentially like a series of statistical algorithms that are actually quite similar to Fristen's functional circle, in the sense that you have your external states and your internal states, and then your world as sensed, and then world of action. I don't know, I'm really intrigued if Fristen himself understands that overlap, or is aware of that overlap. I don't know. But again, the question is, like, where is the arbitrarity? And here we have fixed algorithms that implement statistical models whose goal is utility function, minimize surprisal. So in all these cases, there's kind of a utility function. In other words, they're trying to, like this function is trying to minimize the cost over time through iterations. And somewhat similarly, in spirit at least, this model is trying to minimize surprisal. In essence, it's actually the same from an information theoretic standpoint. It's trying to minimize surprisal. So what does this mean? Minimizing surprisal is essentially what it is, we all would do as humans, trying to create an environment for ourselves that's more predictable. And that's all fine and good. I'm not saying that that's not something we do, but the question is that all we do? Can we stop there and say that, like, semiosis is just minimization of surprisal? As you could guess, I think the answer is no. Play or jokes, or all the different ways that we as a species, or even animals, certainly mammals, play, they're constantly engaging the world in such a way that they're not presupposing the outcome, and they're actually expanding the possibility space in order to discover and explore new inputs, and that we actually have, just this explorer instinct that I think is a necessary aspect of being a living creature. Okay. So coming back to the physiology really quickly, to try and move away from this idea that we could have these kinds of I'll say solipsistic states, like these only internally relevant, like so arbitrary that this symbolicity is completely independent. Like, so this state, for example, in order for it to be functional, has to be completely independent of this state, independent of that state. That's what it means to be discrete. And this gives us really a lot of control and a lot of power. But of course, it simultaneously, there's, as I think Hofmeier clearly understood, and some of you guys understood in some of your guys' responses, that's a trade-off. That with this control, with this utopic kind of control, we lose the ability to be contextually aware. And one of those examples is work done by Dennis Noble on the heart cells. So looking at neurons, for example. So basically, the idea here is that we could argue that, as some people do, as Hofmeier was suggesting, and Donald Favreau, although I know Don, and he would not say that this is digital, but a lot of people like to point to neurons and say, well, see, it's digital. But the problem is, like, well, not only is it really not digital in the strict sense of independent states, it's also not digital even in sort of the looser sense of the fact that the whole point of this experiment by Dennis Noble was showing how it is his model would completely collapse, would completely cease once he took the portion out of his model that was about the voltage, the potential of, let me sketch it really quickly. So if you have a neuron, and you're getting, what we hear a lot about are the synaptic connections. That's certainly a part of neurobiology. But what Dennis Noble is pointing out is that in addition to all of those things, all of those aspects of neurobiology that can be loosely considered as digital, there's also these fields that are more distributed that are actually, so the neurons themselves are generating electromagnetic fields, and then those electromagnetic fields in turn are simultaneously affecting the behavior of the neurons. And so what he's demonstrating here is that these sort of well-modeled functioning of the neuron models both the ion channels and the more traditional aspects of local neural activity, but simultaneously takes into account the local field potential. But then once the local field potential is removed from the model, functioning just collapses. Which is just to say that the neuron is not just like a digital computer that's wired up with wires and has, its action potentials are like a square wave in a computer. He's demonstrating that the neuron, its ability to function is actually also relies on its distributed context. Something that again, going back to this idea that the digital states with the little car thing that so-called looking, the beauty of this, why it works so well, is exactly because it does not have any of this crosstalk, does not have this more distributed sensitivity to distributed phenomena. So really quickly dipping back into kind of the metaphor that I was using earlier, either last class or the class before, that like how is it that we kind of resolve the analog and the digital? How is it that they can coexist? Well, one answer to that question is again that we start with the continuum. We start with the signals that are in fact that we need these. We need the noise, and that they can then relate in a certain way. And as I described last time, they can constructively interfere, for example, like in this quantum mechanics model, and create these constructive interference that then can be observed from the outside as if they're like these discrete phenomenon. And again, then at that point, it's really discreteness is in the eye of the beholder. I think this really can't be overstated. That when we tend to over-reify things, when we look at something and say, oh, see, that's an example of an independent state, and then we can build on independent states without considering where those independent states came from. This is the fallacy. This is what I'm arguing is begging the question. It's circular reasoning. Because assuming this approach, where the two different phenomena, the two aspects of the analog and the digital are resolved, such that their distinctness, as Hofmeier, I think rightly argues, their distinctness can persist, can exist, but that they're also simultaneously related. We see that the so-called digital fundamentally relies on the analog. All right. Any questions on that? Yeah, Sebastian.
How is explained this discrete independent states, where they come from, how is explaining the, not in your theory, but in the others, who they explain this? Where you are saying that this, your point is discussing this, that
Mhm.
they take for granted this independent
Yeah.
state of things.
Yeah.
They explain from where came there, or they don't.
Well, it really depends on, it's so pervasive, the metaphor is so pervasive in our culture that they, like, who is they? Well, it's many different disciplines. Many different disciplines have their own origin story of how they, structuralism, for example, certain aspects of structuralism absolutely presumes the relata. It presumes that which is related so that there can be a difference. I think personally, I think Saussure is more sophisticated than that. When you look at his planes of whatever, I'm not very good at Saussure, but when I have dug into Saussure, I think intuitively he understood that there's something underneath the constitute these states and these juxtapositions. But I think when it comes to, a lot of times what happens is the received, kind of, even Peirce, for example, like a lot of people will just start talking about signs, right? And then treat signs as if they're these tokens, like ones and zeros in a computer or words on a page, and say that word on a page is a symbol. It's like, well, it depends on who you talk to. I mean, if you talk to Peirce, I think Peirce would at most say that was a degenerate sign. It's a token. And it degenerate in the sense that it's not a complete sign. But again, I think in answer to your question is that what happens kind of epistemologically or just sociologically really is that the received wisdom, so to speak, the received body of work of some of these, people that have really thought through all the implications, when it's received, all that gets edited out and people are just left with the tokens, and then they assume that, like, that's all you need because everyone starts doing it. They start, you start saying, oh, here's a sign. Oh, there it's right there. That's the you can plug this into here. Boop, 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 boop. But this is absolutely what I'm arguing against, is that we can't start here. We can get here, but we just can't start here. So I think ultimately the answer to your question is every single discipline has its own way of sort of glossing over the origin story in order to sort of just get into a habit of exchanging white papers that everyone goes, yeah, okay, that system makes sense. But at the end of the day, it has these baked in assumptions that are left. So I guess the real short answer is they don't answer the question.
And in the example when you show about the 7, this system that with the pixels and you explain that all this learning machine at the beginning they need all this randomness. But when arrives to the outcome that is not 7, and it's a cost of one example because the machine needs one example to fix the result.
It actually needs a lot of examples.
So
that's what makes it somewhat generalizable, so that you could put in a novel, like once you train the system and you get it so that it works, say 95% of the time, that working 95% of the time means that you've put in 7s that it wasn't trained on. So you have to train it on a whole host of 7s that are handwritten in different ways. And then those perturb, then you do like tens of thousands of iterations of this. And the reason why you have to randomize all of these weights and balances is because you need that level of dimensionality. You need a huge amount of dimensionality, a huge amount of options, you know, a huge amount of these available states to entail a very complex equation that's able to, you know, delimit like the, you know, the sevenness from sixness, from fiveness, like this huge, really complex, high dimensional phase space of many, well, dimensions.
So this randomness is giving flexibility.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way of, yeah. So the randomness, and you need that. We need that, and
Flexibility to get the output that you need.
yeah, and
But for that also you need a precise feedback, right? For this program of this teaching the machine.
yeah. So these, yeah. So these, well, the machine actually teaches itself more or less. I mean, it has, the algorithms have to be tweaked often, but you know, once a series of algorithms, multiple algorithms here, once a series of algorithms are pretty well established, given the problem, given the nature of the problem, it'll itself be able to automatically hone in on this really complex equation that can do the task of deciding between sixes and sevens and eights. But one thing I want to highlight is that this is actually really important, this super high dimensionality. And so basically we've been and where we'll certainly go is that life has to have this dimensionality too. I don't think it's this way, it's done this way. It's done with the transfinite possibility space. But we'll come back to that. Yeah, this is just the way that sort of modern humans have hacked what it is living systems do actually do. But my argument is they don't do it this way. But this example is a good example of pointing out that such high dimensionality is necessary.
I'm connecting this with the way that's some mechanistic ways to explain some social behaviors, so way to study sociology, like understanding as a black box, that's you have some income and you expect some outcome for the
right,
and they are kind of thinking like this.
Like exactly.
Sometimes these machines also try to think that they are imitating the brain.
Yeah,
working.
exactly. And so what I'm very much trying to sort of pull you guys out of our collective milieu, because we're all immersed in these metaphors and trying to move towards this. So this is very solipsistic, as you've intuited. This is not concerned with, it's only concerned with it insofar as these data sets are super conditioned and managed and curated. But like once those data sets go in, it's a black box, as you say. And so, but what I'm suggesting is that a neuron is never a black box. It's for better, for worse, it's much more complicated, but it's obviously sort of this kind of semiosis, if you will, is the reason for life persisting for 3.8 billion years, which is my argument. And that and this is sort of the punchline of this talk, if you will, is that these two aspects very cleverly are the degenerate modes of evolution that we leverage not only to do this, or your example of someone in sociology trying to explain the evolution of human behavior via some sort of algorithm and randomness, but it's also arguably evolution itself. The theory of evolution is predicated on algorithms and randomness. But very importantly, rather shortly in this talk, I'll just put it up here now, there's a third thing that Peirce actually pointed out and is intrinsic to my own work, which I'll dig into more deeply in subsequent lectures. But so Peirce himself calls this veritable semiosis, if you will, veritable abduction, the ability to come up with a truly creative hypothesis it can't just be based on these. He's not saying that these aren't useful and they're not even, that there may even be necessary, but he's saying that there's a third thing for true evolution, for true development. Okay, yeah, so let me just put it in terms of like an actual, well, bee, an actual animal that has to, this was an interesting experiment where they put the bee in this tunnel with these little squares and in order to understand how the bee was able to navigate. And it was really telling because it became clear that the bee, so what I'm doing here is I'm just superposing a bunch of functional circles here to make the point that, you know, when we're looking at von Uxküll, not to just think that like, oh, we just explain, you know, that living systems are just one functional circle. No, they're like many, many functional circles simultaneously superposed. So it has to see its periphery. It has to know where it's been to some degree. It has to know where it's going to some degree. Bees certainly have to know their orientation to the sun, both for their navigation in real time, but also their ability to go back to the hive and do their little bee dance, which this paper was mostly about. How it is the bee can do something that's arguably symbolicity as it goes back to the hive and is able to communicate to the other bees where a source of nectar is. But this is an absolute mess. I mean, this is all these things, all these circles, functional circles, if you will, are happening in real time, and the bee is, you know, encountering environments that it's never seen before. So, for example, the indeterminate contingencies of the world are, quote, an external rhythm which enters into competition with the internal rhythm of the animal. So again, it gets back to this idea that want to move out of this more solipsistic approach, this black box approach, and von Uxküll is already intuiting this idea that there's, in order to resolve this very real problem of having to come up with novel behaviors in real time, constantly in the face of onslaught of multiple simultaneous and often contradictory input, that it requires these rhythms coming together, and, you know, what Lottman would say that their intention. So this is what I think that what Lottman's talking about when he's talking about tension. But unlike either degenerate case of Peirce's evolution, tychastic chance, aka randomness, and anacastic algorithm, Peirce argues that in genuine agapism, advance takes place by virtue of a positive sympathy among the created, springing from the continuity of mind. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to see the overlap between Uxküll and Peirce to see how, you know, Uxküll doesn't dig super deeply how to do this. Arguably, neither does Peirce, but they both do it. I think they both have a real intuition for how it is we don't get stuck in these arguably degenerate black box-like states, and that we can start talking about positive sympathy, like an efficacious behavior, just the ability for the bee to navigate novel environments as something truly radically creative, springing from the continuity of mind. In other words, the bee is never in the same predicament twice. Therefore, novel solutions to novel problems must be constantly created. This capacity necessitates arbitrarity, but it must be intrinsic and non-random. No time for random exploration of the transfinite possibility space. So in other words, some people will just argue that what evolution is doing, or even some of our systems, is that when you employ an algorithm in randomness, the exploring the random space is actually very costly unless you have some sympathy, some tendency towards one aspect of that infinite possibility space versus another. Otherwise, you just never do anything. So the question is, like, how do you narrow it down to adaptive evolution? If one speaks of the induction of impulses by the perceptual signs, what is meant is not an electrical induction between two wires in parallel at all, but rather the induction that the melody creates in tones, how one tone follows another. So Victoria reminded me of this quote in her response, and it's one of my favorites about Onyx Schools, because I think it's beginning to, again, intuitively get to the idea that these aren't just wires, like in this sort of this analogy of the electrical circuit, that they're, well, what are these melodies and tones? I'm drawn to these metaphors because they've worked for me, but let's go back to physiology to try and suggest how this might work. So this is a paper I wrote with Donald Favreau, trying to talk about exactly answering this exact question of how veritable creativity is possible well, certainly in animals with nervous systems. But one of the key attributes is that, number one, is all of the fields that are being generated down. So these are neurons, and then they have their dendrites, and then they have their ion channels that open and close, and they generate their own ionic currents that then all superpose to generate the local field potential. And then that local field potential simultaneously changes the behavior of each of the ion gates, so that there's both this individual's sympathies. In other words, there's aspects to this larger distributed interference because it's all these different inputs summed at each moment. There's aspects of this interference pattern that different parts of these neurons will then preferentially respond to. And so that the suggestion here is that in order for the living system to navigate this like impossibly large possibility space, is to do it by balancing the local sensitivities and the local actuality, if you will, of the action potential with the more global, distributed, and superposed phenomenon. And this, I think, Hofmeier understands. I think he intuits as well that there's both these aspects, the local and the global, the individual and the collective aspects of the system have to be in tension with each other, and they somehow have to resolve in a way that's neither merely algorithm or randomness. With the question of how can these physiological dynamics be both about themselves and not themselves simultaneously, because this is kind of the crux of arbitrarity. And I think one of the really, really critical aspects of semiosis is that the kind of arbitrarity that we're interested in, a very particular kind of arbitrarity where we can, both ourselves and different, even just aspects of ourselves, can need to simultaneously be about the present and the past and the future at the same time. We need to be, what a veritable sign, so to speak, has to be about itself and not itself simultaneously. Otherwise, there's no aboutness, there's no intentionality. It's merely this solipsistic perfectly discrete state with actually no capacity to relate to another state without a whole host of more discrete states that are managed by sentient beings that then insert the actual the actual semiosis. Does that make sense? Like, does that argument make sense to you guys? Because I think that's what happens a lot, is that we just sort of, it's called a homuncular fallacy, where we just, that's why I wanted to focus on this idea of like, well, who's looking? Well, it's the programmer. But here, like the argument is that a semiotic being is able to has their own intrinsic capacity to realize their own their own goals, like we were talking about at the beginning of the talk, whereas this system doesn't with it. Well, here's coming back to this. One of the critical ways that this works is that the overlapping sympathies. So, for example, like each aspects of many aspects, all the way down to the scale of the at the molecular scale of the ion channels, they each have their own sympathies. They have their own local behavior, but they're contributing to the overall behavior. And then how does then that result into something that we can begin to talk about as signs, so to speak? Well, we can come back to the trichromatic vision, and we can think of blue and red as iconic in the sense that they have sort of a one-to-one mapping with an actual physical phenomenon of blue frequency spectrum and red frequency spectrum. But what's really interesting about magenta, for example, or any number of other colors, is that they're the overlapping sympathies of these two phenomena. So you have two iconic phenomena that are co-occurring, and that co-occurrence is then a higher order phenomenon that could be magenta, for example, and it's predicated on a series of constraints. In other words, and this is really really important, because constraints. So a constraint is something, it's not stipulating what does happen. It's saying what doesn't happen. But as I was saying, I think last class, is that there's still an infinite possibilities, that can happen here, and that this is kind of a sympathy, if you will, if you like have a musical instrument or like a string on a guitar. When you pluck that guitar, it's essentially resonating with all the possible noise that it could the noise of actually the pluck, because you're plucking every string the same, but out of all the possibility of that energy that you're putting in with the pluck, each string is such that it has its own resonance, if you will. But then the question is how it is those two resonances can become a third thing. If each resonance is icon, let's say this is one string or one cone that's sensitive to a certain wavelength of light, and then you have another one that's a second icon. Then when these co-occur, with indexicality, they can actually become a higher order sympathy or icon. which I'll call an icon. Well, we don't have a lot of time left, so the next step would be symbolicity. But yeah, symbolicity is really powerful. And I think it often gets confused. Well, I'll say something quick about it now, but we'll come back to it, because we can talk about, agua, aqua, and Bessie, water, all these different words for a phenomenon that we all share. We can properly call these again, this is a token, this is a token, this is a token, the written word on the page. But if someone knows what agua means and they've experienced water, then it becomes a Persian symbol, then and only then. Then once you've had that experience and you know the word agua, you can learn aqua and Bessie and water, and then that arbitrarity can be extended. But it's really important to remember is that all these overlapping sympathies are required for there to be veritable symbolicity, right? We have to have these experiences. So it's not enough to talk about ones and zeros and say that that's a symbol, not in a Persian sense, not in a properly semiotic sense. Again, they're just tokens. So in that sense, there is the arbitrarity, which is very powerful. But when I hear water or any of these words, since I know what they mean, depending on my context, I mean, I could be, if it's sunny out, I'm going to think of water differently. If I'm thirsty, I'm going to think, it's so contextual. It's so powerful what can be conjured in one's mind with these arbitrary signs, so to speak. But again, they're predicated on iconicity and indexicality. And then it was really a lot today. So what I'll continue to do over the semester is try and clarify this for you guys. And then we could have, you guys could ask questions and push back on this. This idea of how it is these builds. We can bring in other thinkers like Terence Deacon, for example, has talked a lot about this in his book, Symbolic Species. But I'll conclude with basically saying that the genetic code is actually very similar, because it's, the codons, in DNA are also, just like these words are about themselves in some ways, but then they're also not, they're necessarily about themselves and not themselves at the same time. So too is, are aspects of the genetic code. And it's only through, as you guys rightly pointed out in a lot of your responses, it's through the side of the more analogical aspects of the cytoplasm that interprets that code. And it's the aspects of each of those that work together to realize the power of the particular kind of arbitrarity that we're interested in for semiosis. But again, we must be careful how we employ the digital metaphor. Discreteness is emergent and often in the eye of the beholder. To overlay reify such observations is to miss the process entirely. All right, that was a lot. I'll leave it there. Give us a little bit of time.
Now that you bring before you bring the example with the words, I was connecting with the arbitrariness in the linguistic scheme theory, and how there are other theories that are arguing against this arbitrariness of the linguistic sign of the words, that start to show how this other aspect of context influencing the reference of the words and reduce the arbitrariness
Mhm.
quite a lot in some cases.
Yeah, I
So
think
I was thinking that maybe we start to call or use arbitrariness in a way that's to all these aspects of positive sympathies that we are not able to explain all of them, all the variables that one word, for example, has to refer to a specific thing, because also this is historical, it's evolutionary or something.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think part of what it is we do as academics is each generation has to more carefully understand our terms, and arbitrarity is a really good one that needs, it's so easy to, so here's an XOR gate, for example, and we could talk about the arbitrariness of the ones and zeros. They could be, like he said, it could be quantum mechanical instead of bits, it could be qubits, or, so in that sense, it's a certain kind of arbitrarity predicated on discrete states that are designed very specifically to be independent of each other, so that the capacity and the power and the control that's available in these technologies is exactly because they are not contextually aware. They're 100% determined. But I think what you're bringing up very rightly is more has to do with like how it is, whether it's the genetic code or words, like how it is the words affect us, but how we affect the words. There is an aspect of arbitrarity for certain, because I could make up a new word right now that's never, and then we could just agree that this means water. And that's a convention, but amongst the seven of us, six of us. And so there's an arbitrarity there, a necessary arbitrarity there, but it's not this arbitrarity. Because to your point, like this kind of arbitrarity is predicated on all of our shared experiences of actually, experiencing water and having those feelings, that's part of our shared Umwelt. But we still have, because we're symbolic creatures, well, more than most creatures anyway, we do have this extra arbitrarity, what Hofmeyr calls semiotic freedom. We have more semiotic freedom. Yeah.
Maybe there is also a degree of thresholds that we could conceive in language or any other so-called digital system, where there are degrees of analogism or digitality that can overlap in certain areas.
Yeah.
And in language, that would be things that are very arbitrary, but other words that, even though they have no, I guess, iconic relation to any quality of a real object in nature, they derive from misunderstandings or mishearing from other languages. So I had a teacher just tell us now, I don't remember the story, but like the linguistic tree specifically, but that the Estonian word for lion was probably, or is thought to be, the way it is because it was like a mishearing event from another language. Or onomatopoeia is also a thing that is more related to trying to replicate a snake and the word hiss.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, things like that are more closely related to something or an analog idea.
Yeah. Well, that'll be a really critical part of what we talk about, maybe next week, maybe the week after. Next week's epistemic cut, maybe the week after that. But in any case, yeah, the ability, sort of in a Gestalt kind of approach, like you have the figure in the ground, and the like what's salient to you may not be salient to me, and mistakes are actually a classic example, like misinterpretations, mistranslations are well, the way I like to understand that there's just that even right now, like all of us have massive amounts of noise that we're embodying. We're just embodying a massive amount, like the bee that has all those different inputs. And then different sympathies, endeavoring to understand someone else, like trying to understand a word that they're saying or some sort of concept that they're saying. Like at first it can be miming, so at first it's really analog. It's like someone actually handing you something to feel or to see, or they're, gesturing some sort of aspect of it. And these are all constraints on all this potential interpretations. So when these constraints, in a way, we're sort of on the fly generating these thresholds, so that we have, say, overlapping constraints. And then these three constraints could be thought of as, sympathies that we all bring to bear in any given context, because like we're in a classroom, so we bring certain sympathies to bear, we behave certain ways. Culture, like you were saying, like we go into a culture that's familiar versus a culture that's unfamiliar, and we'll bring in different sympathies that will essentially filter this huge possibility space, and draw out of them a signal out of the noise, so to speak, a figure out of the ground, and that we're, I guess, in a sense, recreating thresholds on the fly all the time. Because like the bee, we've never been in this exact situation before. Like there's always that tension of like, well, what is each other really saying? And again, what context we're in. So we have this legacy of reading Vonnegut School and Lotman, in the past lectures, et cetera. So we're all constantly regenerating novel constraints, filters on all this possibility space. And so in a sense, I would suggest we're inventing new thresholds all the time. I guess on that note, I'll show the last slide that I didn't show, because I think this is, in essence, abduction. This is what I think Peirce means by abduction, is exactly this very active effort. I think this is what cytoplasm, in a way, is doing, is that this very active effort of, I was having a conversation with Terrence Deacon years ago about this idea of abduction being these overlapping constraints that, again, are contextually brought in to deal with the onslaught of available information and possible actions, possible interpretants that you could have, but that where it is, I would suggest this is a veritable creativity process of forming an explanatory hypothesis that then we test. So this is where the pragmatics come in, is we get some, you guys say, I say something, then you guys say something in response, and then we're trying to hone in on the process that shall not be named, for ourselves at the very least, and then test it with each other. But I think Peirce is absolutely right that it's the only logical operation which introduces any new idea, this radical creativity, if you will, because induction does nothing but determine a value, and deduction merely evolves the necessary consequences. of those hypotheses. There needs to be a third thing. Okay. I want to do one final little kind of check-in. Try and do this every time, but sort of think of our methodology where we started the course, the process that shall not be named, and so, you know, today we talked about PERS, fire, etc. You know, digital logic. But what I want to hear from you guys is, you know, feel free to just say some things that we did talk about that stuck with you. Like it could be ideas or it could be people. And then, but also like towards this goal, things that you guys think are maybe missing or that you're interested in that maybe we should look at in relation to some of the stuff that we've already talked about. Are there any, you know, thinkers that you guys have been reminded of while doing the reading or?
Within the outer terms, something that stuck with me, I suppose, would be the idea of systems.
Okay. Like systems theory? Or just,
Yeah.
or just more generally?
Systemic operation, system thought, or
Operations, I like that. Actually, this, I have a soft spot for this word because it's Simondon, someone I haven't really tortured you guys with yet, but I might. He talks a lot about operation and trying to resolve some of these conundrums. He talks about the distinction between, well, actually, no, he says the structure and the operation and how they're of each other. But anyway.
also process.
Process. Yeah, I think next week we're talking about the epistemic cut, which is kind of Patti's and Hoffmeier's way of dealing with process. I think it'll be good to dig into it a little bit. I'll give you guys a little bit of reading for that, and then we can talk about it next week. But it'll also be kind of it'll have its problems. And Hoffmeier will point out a number of them that Patti ran into. But I think it'll be a good segue into what I think is a more robust process or a solution to the epistemic cut. Yeah.
A few days ago, I read a paper about abduction and was like framing it as a sort of ignorance mitigating character, in the sense that it's a procedure in which something that, according to the author, as lacks a classical explanatory epistemic virtue can be accepted. And so this made me think about this paper.
Okay. So like abduction as ignorance or
ignorance mitigating character, that if I'm not super into verse, so I don't know if that's.
Great. Would you mind loading that paper, or it's referenced in the
Yes.
forum?
Yes.
Yeah.
Gabby and Woods, they are
Okay. What year? Is it recent? Or?
2005. No,
Okay.
not
Well, for abduction, I think anything in the 2000s is not a lot of people write about abduction. Anything else?
I also thought of a paper that I read a few years ago. It's Van Gelder's What Might Cognition Be If Not Computation. It's something like that.
So cognition is not computation.
Yeah, the main idea is that, and he talks about how it's a dynamical system, and he uses the example of, he uses a weird example. He used a governor problem from the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought of, there were two options, and I thought of, can I think of those two options as analog and digital, but I was not sure about,
Yeah. Do you remember the paper? Can you just put the reference in the forum?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
I think in the chapter, he also gives reference to it. He talked.
Oh, Hoffmeyer did.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure. I remember correctly Van Gelder, but I'm not sure about the year. But I'll send it.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, governor is like, this is, yeah, that's canonical. Like, this is classic cybernetic, like industrial cybernetic body of work. Yeah, for sure. Going back to the steam engine. That's what, yeah, the governor is governing.
Yeah, happened that I'm taking a course here in philosophy in our neighbors and Heidegger lectures, Heidegger readings, and I'm connecting this class, what we are discussing with things on Heidegger. That's
Any particular concept of Heidegger? Or?
yes, because he says like in a short paper that is about on the essence of truth. He talked about truth being the essence of truth being the freedom. And when he talked about freedom, he said like let it be as they are, and this because he thinks that beings express or manifest themselves as they are. And this
that they have like an intrinsic nature, that they have like a
yes, and this what's is separated this phenomenology from first paralleloscopy, because from Heidegger these intuitions, we can access objects in the reality immediately. And there's always I say like there is a mediation.
Oh right, direct realism
and
versus
connecting this with this model that you are showing, that this noise and the positive sympathies. And I'm connecting this like, okay, maybe what is missing in Heidegger way of explaining that he's taking for granted the relative.
Yeah.
Because it's like beings are no essential things, but in a relatedness.
Yeah.
But he doesn't explain how it's working.
Yeah.
For him, if the beings just appear like he said, like the flowers bloom, they open up in this open space. And for me, this open space I'm related with this multiplicity of noise. And what open up is this positive sympathy. Now in my mind connected.
Yeah.
So
was it a particular paper that you can, it was,
yeah,
oh, it was this paper, Essence of Truth?
Yeah, it's
okay.
Essence of,
yeah.
It's like a part of basic writings or something like that. It's a book, and one chapter or one section is on the essence of truth.
Cool. Awesome. Check that out. I'll take a picture of this and maybe I'll load that And you guys can add stuff, ideas and whatnot.
Also related to the past lesson. To
What's that?
also related to the past lesson, the infinity.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, next class we'll tie some of those things together too. We'll bring infinity back in for sure. Yeah. Infinity, the transfinite. All right, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.